People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. Well, those infamous words spoken by Richard Nixon, they really hint at the profound complexities we're about to explore. Welcome to the deep dive, where we meticulously sift through sources to bring you the most compelling insights, all to still for clarity and impact. Today, we're embarking on an in-depth exploration of Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. His life story is, well, it's a remarkable tapestry of contradictions. It took him from incredibly humble beginnings right to the pinnacle of American power, then through this, dramatic downfall and an equally surprising return to influence. Our sources for this journey offer a really rich biographical perspective, highlighting the pivotal moments and the deeply personal decisions that shaped his unparalleled career. Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We aim to peel back the layers of Nixon's public and private life, really moving beyond the well-worn headlines and those common caricatures you always see. We want to understand the intricate web of triumphs and controversies that didn't just define his personal legacy, but profoundly altered the trajectory of American history. We'll examine his surprising policy shifts, his, let's say, calculated political maneuvers, and the intensely private individual behind that formidable public persona. So if you've ever found yourself wondering how one person could simultaneously be celebrated as like a groundbreaking foreign policy architect and condemned as a political pariah, this deep dive is for you. We'll consider what lessons his incredible story holds for understanding leadership, power dynamics, and, the ever-shifting sands of public perception. So where should we even begin with such a monumental figure?
I think it's vital to begin right at the very root of his character. It was forged in this crucible of early hardship. His entire life, even from those earliest days, really laid the groundwork for the complexities we saw later. It just shows how deeply personal experiences, especially struggles, can profoundly shape a public figure's ambition and resilience, ultimately, dictating their path.
That's a powerful way to frame it. His early life was indeed marked by what many would describe as significant hardship. Born January 9, 1913, Yorba Linda, California. Richard Nixon grew up in a poor Quaker family. His mother, Hannah Milhouse, was a devout Quaker, and his father, Francis A. Nixon, actually converted to the faith. It's kind of interesting. He was named after Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah, quite a name.
A rather grand and historical name for a boy from such modest circumstances, maybe hinting at a destiny beyond his environment. Who knows? His Quaker upbringing, though, that was incredibly influential. It instilled this strict adherence to principles like abstinence from alcohol, dancing, swearing. It was a rigorous, disciplined environment. He once quoted Dwight Eisenhower, reflecting on his own boyhood, saying, "We were poor, but the glory of it was we didn't know it." That phrase really captures the stoicism and resilience of his youth.
Mm-hmm.
The family faced real economic struggles. Their lemon ranch failed in 1922, forcing a move to Whittier, where his father opened a grocery store and gas station. And compounding these financial pressures, the early loss of his brother Arthur at just 7 years old, combined with Richard's own lung scare, a spot that meant he was forbidden from playing sports due to a family history of tuberculosis. Well, it paints a picture of a challenging, even somber youth.
Yeah, it definitely sounds tough.
This environment undoubtedly fostered a profound sense of ambition and self-reliance that would stay with him.
Absolutely. This challenging youth, marked by economic hardship and personal loss, it was this crucible that forged Nixon's profound ambition and self-reliance, traits that would, well, both propel and plague him throughout his career. Think about his early academic journey. He attended East Whittier Elementary, where he was already the 8th grade class president. That's an early indicator of his leadership aspirations, right?
Even then.
His parents, they were concerned about an older brother's dissolute lifestyle at Whittier High, so they initially sent Richard to the larger Fullerton Union High School. Despite a long bus ride each way, his grades were excellent, reflecting this intense dedication. He even played junior varsity football, though apparently he rarely saw game time. Still, shows commitment, being part of a team even when not in the spotlight. What's really striking is his early success as a debater. He won numerous championships. And he received formal public speaking tutelage from H. Lynn Scheller, who advised him, remember, speaking is conversation. Don't shout at people. Talk to them. Converse with them. Nixon reportedly tried to adopt this conversational tone throughout his career, though, with varying degrees of success, given his naturally reserved nature.
So he's excelling academically and in debate, but then he transfers to Whittier High in his junior year. What happens there?
Well, that's where he experienced his first electoral defeat. Lost the student body president election.
Yeah.
This early taste of loss, combined with the immense responsibilities he carried, like rising at 4 a.m. to drive the family truck to LA to pick up vegetables for the store, especially after his brother Harold got diagnosed with tuberculosis, it truly shaped a disciplined, hardworking, but maybe also guarded individual. You can certainly see the seeds of his later political style and, that perceived guardedness in these formative years. Despite everything, he graduated third in his class of 207. Again, underscores his unwavering academic prowess.
That's an incredible level of responsibility for a high school kid.
Yeah.
It highlights not just academic talent, but an intense work ethic from a really young age. After Whittier, he attended Whittier College in 1930. His tuition was funded by his maternal grandfather because the family still needed his help at the store, especially with Harold's continued illness. He even tried out for football, apparently more known for his enthusiasm than his size.
Right, the hustle.
And here's a small kind of telling detail about his character.
Yeah.
He was snubbed by the prominent Franklin's Literary Society. But instead of just accepting the slight, he responded by co-founding a new rival society, the Orthogonian Society.
Oh, interesting.
This early pattern, being an outsider, then actively building his own path instead of just accepting rejection, seems pretty characteristic. He graduated summa cum laude, highest distinction in history, in 1934. Then got accepted to the prestigious Duke University School of Law in 1934, received a scholarship for top students, managed to keep it despite intense competition. He was elected president of the Duke Bar Association, inducted into the Order of the Coif, and graduated third in his class in 1937. That's a formidable academic record by any standard.
It absolutely is. It underscores a persistent academic drive and a remarkable capacity for hard work that would characterize his entire career. After Duke, he initially hoped to join the FBI. Yeah, but his application was canceled due to budget cuts during the Depression. This early disappointment might have, further fueled his ambition, prompting him to seek success in other arenas. He then returned to Whittier, practiced law with Winger and Bewley, focused on commercial litigation and wills. Interestingly, he apparently disliked divorce cases, particularly the frank sexual talk from women.
Little insight there.
Yeah, a small but revealing detail, glimpse into his reserved, maybe somewhat uncomfortable personality. He eventually opened his own branch, became a full partner, and later proudly claimed to be the only modern president to have been a practicing attorney.
And he also had that failed venture, right? The frozen orange juice business. Citrafrost.
That's right, yeah. Went bankrupt after 18 months.
Shows he wasn't afraid to take risks, even if they didn't always pan out. It's also important to remember this wasn't just a dry legal career. During this period, he met Thelma Pat Ryan.
In community theater, wasn't it?
Yeah, in a Whittier Community Players production in 1938. He described it as love at first sight, though famously she turned him down multiple times before they finally married on June 21st, 1940. They went on to have 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie. These foundational years, they built a disciplined, ambitious, and, somewhat reserved individual who would soon be thrust into the tumultuous world of wartime Washington and eventually national politics.
Looking at this early period, it's clear these formative experiences, the Quaker discipline, economic hardship, academic excellence, that early electoral setback, and the drive to make his own way, they were all crucial ingredients. They instilled a deep sense of duty and a pragmatic approach to overcoming obstacles, which is exactly what he'd need in the coming years.
Speaking of duty and overcoming obstacles, the outbreak of World War II presented another pivotal moment. January 1942, he and Pat moved to Northern Virginia. He took a job at the Office of Price Administration in D.C., working in tire rationing.
Glamorous work.
Right. He didn't enjoy it, said it limited his prospects. Just 4 months later, he made a decision that surprised quite a few people.
This choice, I think, speaks volumes about his character. Despite being a birthright Quaker, a heritage that traditionally offered draft exemption, and having a professional deferral because of his government service, Nixon applied to join the U.S. Navy.
Wow.
Yeah. Appointed lieutenant junior grade in June 1942. This decision to serve, going against both his heritage and available deferrals, it really highlights a strong sense of duty or maybe an underlying desire for a path entirely different from his legal career. Suggests a certain restlessness, maybe? A drive to prove himself in a more challenging, active environment.
It's an important distinction, isn't it? He wasn't just serving, he was choosing to serve, despite legitimate reasons not to. He initially was an aide in Iowa, but he sought more excitement, requested sea duty. He was then assigned to the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command, SCAP, in World War II. There he managed logistics for operations in places like Vella, Lavella, Bougainville, Nissan Island, overseeing loading and unloading of transport aircraft.
Critical work.
Absolutely. And for this, he received a Navy Letter of Commendation, later upgraded to the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for meritorious and efficient performance of duty. Upon his return to the U.S., he served as an administrative officer at Alameda Naval Air Station, then transferred to the Bureau of Aeronautics, negotiating contract terminations for the Navy. Received a second commendation from the Secretary of the Navy for meritorious service, tireless effort, and devotion to duty.
Wow.
Promoted to lieutenant commander in October 1945 and eventually retired as a commander in June 1966.
And here's a truly fascinating detail from his time in the Navy that reveals that practical mindset. He became an exceptionally skilled 5-card stud poker player.
No kidding.
Seriously. He actually used his winnings to help finance his first congressional campaign. A remarkable example of foresight and resourcefulness, right?
That's incredible.
There's even an anecdote about him turning down an invitation to dine with Charles Lindbergh because he was hosting a poker game. Illustrates his commitment to the game and its potential practical use, even in unusual circumstances. This period of military service, often overlooked, it really forged an individual who was adaptable, resourceful, and capable of strategic thinking, whether at the poker table or managing wartime logistics.
Certainly sounds like he honed some essential skills. So after the war, he makes this decisive shift straight into the political fray. California Republicans in the 12th Congressional District, they were desperate to unseat the Democratic Representative Jerry Voorhees.
Right.
A committee of 100 was formed to find a strong candidate, and Herman Perry, a family friend and bank manager, suggested Nixon. After an enthused response from Nixon, he was selected. He left the Navy in early '46 and embarked on this year of intensive campaigning. He quickly established his anti-communist credentials by portraying Voorhees as ineffective, linking him to communist sympathizers, a tactic that would become, well, a hallmark of his early career. Nixon won the 1946 election decisively, 65,586 votes to Voorhees' 49,994. In Congress, he immediately got to work. Supported the Taft-Hartley Act, which monitored labor unions, served on the Herter Committee, one of 19 House members, youngest only Westerner advocating for the Marshall Plan, an early indication of his growing influence and grasp of foreign policy.
This period really shows how his early anti-communist stance became such a powerful political tool, just catapulting him onto the national stage. The Alger Hiss case, in particular, that solidified his reputation.
Yes, Hiss.
August 1948, member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. Nixon gained national attention. Many initially doubted Whittaker Chambers' allegations that Alger Hiss, a former State Department official, was a Soviet spy. But Nixon persisted. He believed Chambers. After Hiss sued for defamation, Chambers produced the infamous Pumpkin Papers documents and microfilm he'd hidden overnight in a pumpkin patch, actually corroborating his claims. Hiss was eventually convicted of perjury in 1950 for denying under oath he'd passed documents to Chambers.
I was huge.
Absolutely critical. It defined Nixon's reputation as a leading anti-communist and demonstrated his tenacity, often against prevailing public opinion. He even co-sponsored the Munt-Nixon bill, requiring registration of Communist Party members. Although it ultimately failed in the Senate, the Nixon Library considers its passage in the House his first significant victory. It truly established him as a formidable political force.
So he clearly made a name for himself as this determined anti-communist. Building on that momentum, he ran for the U.S. Senate in 1949, won the primary against Helen Gaffenden Douglas, and what followed was a truly contentious campaign. Nixon focused heavily on Douglas's liberal voting record, and his campaign controversially distributed this pink sheet comparing her record to Vito Marcantonio, a figure reputed to be a communist. Yeah. This aggressive tactic led opponents to coin that enduring nickname, Tricky Dick. He won by almost 20 percentage points, cementing his reputation for a tough, sometimes ruthless political style. In the Senate, he continued to take a prominent position opposing global communism, traveling frequently, speaking out against it. He maintained friendly but distant relations with Joseph McCarthy, carefully avoiding being too closely associated with McCarthy's more extreme allegations.
Smart move.
Domestically, he supported statehood for Alaska and Hawaii, civil rights for minorities, federal disaster relief, while voting against price controls, benefits for illegal immigrants, and public power initiatives.
This highlights a really calculated political approach, navigating complex ideological waters while consistently reinforcing that anti-communist image. Which leads us directly to the Checkers speech.
Checkers.
A pivotal moment that truly reshaped the role of the modern vice presidency. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower selected Nixon as his running mate. recognized his youth, his strong anti-communist stance, his California base. Nixon was only 39, quite young for such a national role.
Yeah, very young.
However, mid-September 1952, major crisis erupts. Media reports that Nixon had a political fund, maintained by backers, reimbursing him for political expenses. Though not strictly illegal, it sparked allegations of conflict of interest. Intense pressure mounted on Eisenhower to drop him from the ticket created one of the most memorable, dramatic moments in American political history.
This is where it gets absolutely captivating. September 23, 1952, Nixon addresses the nation on live television. This checker speech, seen by an estimated 60 million Americans, the largest audience for a TV broadcast at that point.
Incredible reach for the time.
He emotionally defended the fund, claimed it wasn't secret, donors received no special favors, cast himself as a patriot of modest means, mentioning Pat wore a respectable Republican cloth coat, not mink. And then, of course, the enduring, iconic detail. He spoke of a gifted little Cocker Spaniel dog named Checkers, which his daughter Tricia loved, and he refused to give back. This wasn't just a political speech. It was a masterful theatrical performance. It weaponized empathy, generated this massive public outpouring of support that saved his career, and demonstrated the raw power of television to reshape public perception in a single dramatic stroke.
What's truly fascinating here is how Eisenhower, recognizing Nixon's capabilities and, newly affirmed popularity, subsequently granted him more responsibilities than any previous vice president. Nixon attended and even chaired Cabinet and National Security Council meetings in Eisenhower's absence. His extensive 1953 tour of the Far East, including visits to Saigon and Hanoi in French Indochina, not only increased goodwill but gave Nixon a profound appreciation for the region, something that would resonate decades later.
Foreshadowing.
Biographer Erwin Gelman aptly called Nixon the first modern vice president. This expanded role was put to a significant test in 1955 when Eisenhower suffered a heart attack. With no formal power under the as-yet unproposed 25th Amendment for presidential disability, Nixon carefully presided over cabinet meetings, ensuring no power vacuum or grabs, earned high praise for his conduct, demonstrating remarkable restraint and stability during a national crisis.
And his international engagement didn't stop there. 1958, Goodwill tours South America. Nixon encountered fierce anti-American protests in Lima, Peru, was even spat on by hostile mobs in Caracas, Venezuela, where his limo was attacked.
Wow, intense.
Despite the clear danger, he courageously confronted the students directly in Lima, and his fearless conduct earned him grudging respect, even from his bitterest enemies. Nixon, true to his convictions, attributed these protests to a central communist conspiracy, reinforcing his long-held worldview. Then, in 1959, Eisenhower sent him to the Soviet Union for the American National Exhibition in Moscow. There, Nixon engaged in that impromptu, unscripted debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev at a model American kitchen display.
The kitchen debate. Famous.
Exactly. A striking ideological contrast of capitalism versus communism played out on a global stage. This entire period really solidified Nixon's image as a tenacious debater, a strong anti-communist, and a growing figure on the world stage. All crucial groundwork for his own presidential ambitions.
His vice presidency was indeed a masterclass in preparing for the top job, albeit with some dramatic turns that tested his political mettle and public image.
So after 8 intense years as vice president, Nixon was ready to take the top spot himself. Launched his first presidential campaign on January 9, 1960. Faced little primary opposition, chose former Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. as his running mate.
Right.
The race against the young John F. Kennedy was incredibly close, generated immense national interest. Nixon campaigned heavily on his experience, highlighting his time as VP, while Kennedy called for new blood and raised concerns about a perceived missile gap with the Soviets. What's truly a game-changer here are the televised presidential debates. First time ever.
Huge deal.
In the first of 4, Nixon appeared pale, unshaven, visibly uncomfortable under the bright studio lights, presented a stark contrast to the exceptionally photogenic Kennedy.
Image matters.
This visual disparity was significant. Many viewers watching on TV felt Nixon performed poorly, while interestingly, radio listeners often thought he had won. This moment vividly illustrates the nascent but powerful influence of television in politics, where presentation could, for some, dramatically overshadow substance.
It's a critical moment, highlights the change in nature of political campaigning and image-making. Nixon narrowly lost that election by only 112,827 popular votes, a mere 0.2% margin.
So close.
Despite charges of voter fraud in key states like Texas and Illinois, Nixon refused to contest the election. believed a prolonged dispute would harm the U.S.'s international image during the height of the Cold War. This decision, though likely personally painful, reflected a sense of national interest over individual ambition at that moment. After leaving the VP role in January '61, he returned to California, practiced law, wrote his best-selling memoir, Six Crises, covering pivotal moments like Eisenhower's heart attack, the Checkers speech.
That's a huge decision, not contesting an election that close, especially with credible allegations.
Yeah.
But his political career wasn't quite over yet. Republican leaders soon encouraged him to run for California governor in 1962 against incumbent Pat Brown.
Reluctantly, right.
Yeah, he reluctantly entered the race. A decision that proved to be another critical juncture. This campaign was plagued by public suspicion. He viewed the governorship merely as a stepping stone to another presidential run. Some opposition from the far right of his own party, and his own apparent lack of genuine enthusiasm for the job. He lost to Brown by over 5 percentage points, a defeat widely believed to be the definitive end of his political career. And here's where we get another one of his iconic, though perhaps more tragic, quotes.
The press conference.
In an impromptu, often emotional concession speech, he famously blamed the media, declaring, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." It truly seems like a definitive dramatic end to his public life.
What's interesting is that even in such a crushing defeat, a surprising turn of events generated public sympathy for him. Alger Hiss.
Hiss again.
The man Nixon helped convict made a controversial appearance on a TV show, Howard K. Smith. News and comment right after Nixon's loss. Many found it unseemly to give a convicted felon airtime to attack a former VP. The resulting public furor actually led to the program being taken off the air.
Wow.
This backlash, ironically, boosted public sympathy for Nixon during his so-called wilderness years. During this period, he traveled extensively in Europe, met various leaders, then moved to New York City to become a senior partner in a prominent law firm, largely stayed out of the '64 election, endorsed Barry Goldwater, campaigned loyally, even though he privately felt Goldwater was unlikely to win.
Smart calculation.
Maybe. Goldwater's landslide loss meant Nixon wasn't blamed for the defeat, strategically positioning him for a future return. His political rehabilitation continued with successful campaigning for Republicans in the '66 congressional elections, widely credited with significant gains for the party.
And in a surprising display of his underlying legal prowess, in 1967, he even argued his only case before the U.S. Supreme Court, Time, Inc. v. Hill.
Really? I didn't
Right.
know that.
Yeah. Defended a family's privacy against the press, a remarkable act for a politician who often had such a contentious relationship with the media. Though he ultimately lost the case, he received praise for his argument. Showcased a hidden skill, a continued intellectual engagement few might have expected. This period proved that Nixon, despite being kicked around, was far from out.
It clearly shows that resilience was a core defining element of his character. Constantly testing the waters, adapting, finding new avenues to engage, he simply refused to disappear.
And that resilience paid off handsomely in 1968. End of '67, Nixon told his family he planned to run for president again. Pat Nixon, who famously didn't always enjoy the intense scrutiny, remember the Checkers speech embarrassment,
Right.
was still supportive. The political landscape was incredibly tumultuous. Democrats deeply divided over Vietnam, the Tet Offensive in January '68, LBJ's withdrawal, Robert F. Kennedy's assassination in June, created an atmosphere of national unrest, profound upheaval.
A chaotic year.
Nixon, now a highly seasoned political operator, secured the Republican nomination on the first ballot, partly by making strategic concessions to Southern delegates like Strom Thurmond and Harry Dent to gain their crucial support. He chose Maryland Governor Spiro Agnew as his running mate. Believed Agnew would help unite the party, appealing to both Northern moderates and disaffected Southerners.
Looking at the bigger picture, Nixon's strategy in the general election was a masterstroke of political positioning. He faced Vice President Hubert Humphrey, nominated at a Democratic convention marred by violent protests, deep national division. Nixon presented himself as a figure of stability, directly appealing to what he would famously call the silent majority, socially conservative Americans deeply uneasy with the counterculture and the anti-war movement. Agnew's vocal criticism of these groups further reinforced Nixon's image as the candidate for law and order.
He waged a prominent television advertising campaign, stressing rising crime rates, accusing Democrats of surrendering U.S. nuclear superiority. On Vietnam, he promised peace with honor, hinting tantalizingly at a secret plan to end the war without specifics, which kept voters hopeful. His slogan, "Nixon's the one," proved highly effective.
There was also that controversy, wasn't there? About his campaign possibly interfering with Johnson's peace
Yeah,
talks?
the Chennault affair. Allegations they tried to prevent an October surprise that might have helped Humphrey, still debated today. In a tight three-way race against Humphrey and American Independent Party candidate George Wallace, Nixon won by a narrow popular vote margin less than 1%, but secured a clear electoral college majority with 301 votes. Became the first non-incumbent vice president elected president.
Quite a comeback.
In his victory speech, he notably pledged to unite the divided nation, even expressed empathy for Humphrey, saying, "I know exactly how he felt. I know how it feels to lose a close one."
His inauguration, January 20th, 1969, overseen by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Pat Nixon held the Bible open to Isaiah 2.4 about beating swords into plowshares. Nixon himself declared, "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title peacemaker," a phrase later inscribed on his gravestone. He spoke of turning partisan politics into a new age of unity, urging an end to inflated rhetoric. What's striking is the stark contrast between these lofty ideals of unity and peacemaking and the often aggressive political tactics he employed to gain power, foreshadowing the complex, contradictory legacy he'd leave.
And that pursuit of peacemaker status truly defined his foreign policy, as we'll explore next.
It's important to consider how Nixon's inaugural address emphasizing peacemaker wasn't just rhetoric. It was a clear signal of his foreign policy ambitions. Really highlights his strategic realist approach, often executed in remarkably close collaboration with Henry Kissinger.
Kissinger.
His national security advisor, later Secretary of State, they famously worked together, frequently bypassing traditional cabinet officials to implement their unique vision for America's role in the world.
So let's delve into one of the most dramatic, unexpected shifts.
Yeah.
The opening to China. Nixon had actually laid the intellectual groundwork even before becoming president. Wrote in Foreign Affairs that there is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation.
Bold statement back then.
His motivations were multifaceted. Weaken the Soviet Union, decrease China's support for North Vietnam. Crucially, he managed to get support from conservatives like Goldwater and Reagan by framing it not as capitulation, but as strategic leverage against the Soviets. The breakthrough came early '71. A Chinese invitation for an American table tennis team, ping pong diplomacy,
Right, the ping pong.
served as the unexpected catalyst. Kissinger then made a series of clandestine visits to China, laying the groundwork. July 15, 1971, the public learned of the president's planned visit. This secrecy was vital, allowed both nations to prepare their political climates for such a dramatic, potentially controversial shift.
The historic visit itself, February 1972, was meticulously prepared. Kissinger briefed Nixon for over 40 hours. Upon arrival, Nixon made that pointed, symbolic gesture, shaking Premier Zhu Enlai's hand on the tarmac, something Secretary Dulles had refused in '54. Underscored the shift. Nixon strategically prioritized TV coverage over print, a clear snub to journalists he disliked, but a shrewd move to showcase the visit's monumental significance directly to the American public.
Playing the media game.
During their meetings, Nixon and Kissinger engaged extensively with Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhu. Mao, surprisingly, was impressed by Nixon's forthrightness, though remained somewhat suspicious of Kissinger. A formal banquet, the joint communique recognizing Taiwan as part of China, anticipating a peaceful solution, marked a truly new chapter. Pat Nixon's tours of Beijing Forbidden City, Great Wall, communes, schools offered Americans their first real glimpse into everyday Chinese life, demystifying a once-isolated nation. This single visit ushered in a new era of U.S.-China relations and, fearing a potential U.S.-China alliance, pressured the Soviet Union into détente, a key component of triangular diplomacy.
That's a huge diplomatic chess move, changing the entire global calculus. But while opening to China, Nixon also faced the incredibly daunting, deeply divisive task of ending the Vietnam War. When he took office, 300 American soldiers were dying weekly. The war was incredibly unpopular, fueling violent protests. Nixon quickly concluded the war couldn't be won militarily, determined to end it swiftly, aimed for an arrangement allowing U.S. withdrawal while securing South Vietnam's independence.
A tough balancing act.
This meant a complex strategy of both escalation and de-escalation. He approved secret B-52 carpet bombing in Cambodia, Operation Menu, starting March '69, without Cambodian consent, targeting North Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge positions to cut off supply lines. Simultaneously began peace talks in Paris, sent a personal letter to North Vietnamese leaders. May '69, publicly proposed mutual troop withdrawal, internationally supervised elections.
This really highlights the inherent contradictions. pursuing peace while simultaneously expanding the conflict. While pursuing peace, he also introduced Vietnamization, gradually replacing U.S. troops with Vietnamese forces, initiating phased withdrawals. Yet at the same time, authorized incursions into Laos to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, announced a ground invasion of Cambodia in April 1970, ostensibly targeting North Vietnamese bases. This expansion, especially into Cambodia at the request of the Khmer Rouge, sparked massive protests at home, Kent State shootings.
Gotcha.
Nixon's credibility gap grew between his public peace promises and the bombing escalation, which tragically killed between 50,000 and 150,000 people in Cambodia from 1970-73. Further complicating things, Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers,
Where's the leak?
a classified history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam in '71. Nixon and Kissinger tried to prevent publication, but the Supreme Court sided with the newspapers. Finally, conscription phased out by '73, leading to an all-volunteer force. The Paris Peace Accords, early '73, established a ceasefire, allowed U.S. troop withdrawal, but crucially, didn't require North Vietnamese regulars to leave the South.
And the truce didn't last.
No. Fighting quickly resumed, and North Vietnam ultimately conquered South Vietnam in 1975.
A deeply complex, ultimately tragic chapter in American history, left a profound scar. But that pivot to China also provided Nixon significant leverage to engage strategically with the Soviet Union, leading to détente and landmark arms control agreements.
Yeah, that triangular diplomacy again.
Nixon skillfully exploited the improving relations with China to press the Soviets on nuclear peace and broader geopolitical issues. May 1972, Nixon and Pat undertook that historic visit to Moscow. Met with Brezhnev, Kosygin, Podgorny. Intense negotiations led to increased trade and 2 landmark arms control treaties. SALT first, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The first comprehensive limitation pact between the superpowers, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, banning missile interceptor systems, fundamentally altering the nuclear landscape. Nixon and Brezhnev proudly declared a new era of peaceful coexistence.
What's truly illuminating here is the concept of linkage that Nixon and Kissinger employed. They sought to link arms control with resolving other pressing issues, Middle East, Berlin, Vietnam, creating this complex web of interconnected diplomacy. While central to their détente policy, historian David Tal argues this linkage ultimately failed due to flawed assumptions about Soviet priorities, particularly the belief the Soviets wanted strategic arms limits more than the U.S. did.
Interesting critique.
However, the broader strategy to pressure Hanoi was undeniably effective. Both China and the Soviet Union, wary of a potential U.S.-China alliance, reduced diplomatic support for North Vietnam, advised Hanoi to negotiate. Nixon's aim was explicitly to make Hanoi feel less confident and be pressured into negotiating. This interconnectedness was truly ambitious. In '73, Nixon further encouraged economic ties, pushing the Export-Import Bank to finance a massive $20 billion trade deal with the Soviet Union involving Occidental petroleum phosphate, ammonia, ports, pipelines.
Oh, huge deal.
He also sought most favored nation trade status for the USSR, which Congress challenged with the Jackson-Vanik Amendment.
His efforts weren't limited to a single breakthrough. Made a second trip to the Soviet Union in '74, met Brezhnev in Yalta, discussed a mutual defense pact, continued détente, MIRVs, those multiple warhead missiles complicating arms control.
Right, MIRV has changed the game.
While no significant breakthroughs occurred on that second trip, it underscored his persistent engagement on the world stage, even as domestic troubles began to mount.
This really highlights how these grand geopolitical maneuvers profoundly affected regional conflicts, too. In the Middle East, the Nixon doctrine shifted from direct combat aid to assisting allies in defending themselves, led to greatly increased arms sales to key players like Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Nixon's administration strongly supported Israel, but he saw that support as conditional, believed Israel should make peace, U.S. aid could be leveraged, pragmatically felt American Jewish voters would oppose his re-election regardless, freeing him to pursue what he saw as a more balanced policy.
Cold calculation.
The complexities escalated dramatically during the Yom Kippur War, October '73. Arab coalition Egypt, Syria attacked Israel, supported by Soviet arms. Israel suffered heavy losses. Nixon personally ordered a massive airlift to resupply Israel, bypassing bureaucracy, taking direct responsibility.
Crucial intervention.
The subsequent truce negotiations then rapidly escalated into a superpower crisis when Brezhnev threatened unilateral military enforcement. Nixon responded by ordering the U.S. military to DEFCON 3.
Closest to nuclear war since Cuba.
Exactly, a clear signal of resolve. Brezhnev ultimately backed down.
This was an incredibly high-stakes moment, pushing the world to the brink. The fallout, however, was significant. OPEC nations retaliated with an oil embargo against the U.S.
Oh yeah, the gas lines.
Widespread gasoline shortages, rationing at home, major economic shock. The embargo eventually ended as peace efforts progressed and the U.S. reestablished relations with Egypt for the first time since '67. Nixon saw this as the best opportunity in 15 years to build a lasting peace. He even made one of his final international visits as president to the Middle East in June '74, becoming the first sitting American president to visit Israel.
Quite a trip, given everything else going on.
On the other side of the world, South Asia. The U.S. viewed Pakistan as a crucial anti-communist bulwark. Nixon had a surprisingly strong rapport with President Yahya Khan. During the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971, the U.S. sided with Pakistan against Bengali nationalists' diplomatic military threats. Nixon urged Khan to exercise restraint, fearing an Indian invasion would significantly strengthen Soviet influence.
What's striking here is the complex balancing act. In the subsequent Indo-Pakistani War, Nixon publicly blamed Pakistan for starting, India for escalating, ultimately favoring a ceasefire. U.S. used aid cutoff threats to pressure Pakistan, while simultaneously continuing military aid to prevent deeper Indian incursions. And in a surprising, often controversial move, when Pakistan's defeat seemed imminent, Nixon sent the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise to the Bay of Bengal despite denying direct military involvement.
Sending message.
These actions really highlight the intricate, often contradictory nature of his foreign policy, a blend of strategic pragmatism, personal rapport, and high-stakes maneuvering on a truly global scale.
Shifting our focus now to the home front. Nixon inherited an economy in '69 with 4.7% inflation, highest since the Korean War, large budget deficits from Great Society, Vietnam War, low unemployment but soaring interest rates, highest in a century.
Tough hand to be dealt.
Initially, Nixon, being more interested in foreign policy, did little to alter Johnson's economic policies. Unfortunately, led to a struggling economy in '70, Republican losses in midterms. Remember, Democrats controlled both houses throughout his entire presidency, limiting his domestic legislative power. He also proposed new federalism, advocating greater local autonomy through grants to states, though Congress was largely hostile. Still gained political credit for advocating them. Here's where his approach gets truly fascinating. Facing unresolved inflation, looming re-election, Nixon convened his economic advisors at Camp David, August '71.
Camp David Accords. No, wait, wrong one. Camp David Economic Summit.
Right. He then announced what became known as the Nixon shock. Imposed temporary wage and price controls, allowed a dollar to float against other currencies, dramatically ended its convertibility to gold. Effectively took the U.S. off the gold standard entirely.
This was genuinely radical for a Republican president. Reflected a willingness to challenge economic orthodoxy when faced with political pressure. As political economist Nigel Bowles notes, it made it difficult for Democratic opponents to criticize him, as he was enacting policies usually associated with the left.
Yes, stole their thunder.
Thomas Oatley, another political economist, even attributes the collapse of the Bretton Woods system to Nixon's desire to win the '72 election. These policies did effectively dampen inflation through '72, undeniably contributing to his landslide re-election. However, their after effects also contributed to inflation later in his second term and into the Ford administration.
Short-term gain, long-term pain.
Possibly. After his re-election, inflation, driven by other factors, returned. He reimposed price controls in June '73, which quickly became unpopular, led to unexpected consequences like food shortages, meat disappearing, farmers drowning chickens rather than selling at a loss due to mandated prices.
Wow. Crazy side effects.
The controls were slowly ended. Authorization lapsed April '74. This entire episode highlights Nixon's pragmatic, sometimes ideologically flexible, willingness to implement bold, even contradictory policies when faced with pressing domestic issues and electoral considerations.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it, to see a conservative president enact such a range of progressive domestic initiatives. For instance, eliminating the cabinet-level post office department, creating the government-run United States Postal Service in 1971. Major restructuring.
Yeah, big change.
On the environmental front, while not a major issue in '68, Nixon discussed it prominently in his '70 State of the Union. Skillfully leveraged public interest sparked by the first Earth Day, April '70, to establish the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in June '70. Other significant initiatives followed. Clean Air Act of 1970, Endangered Species Act of 1973, creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. The National Environmental Policy Act also required environmental impact statements for federal projects, lasting framework.
What's striking here is historian Charles Malazzo's assertion that Richard Nixon's environmental legacy is secure, pointing to these significant achievements. However, some historians argue his motives were more political expediency, capitalizing on growing public concern, than genuine, deep-seated environmentalism.
The eternal question, conviction or calculation?
Regardless of motivation, the impact was undeniably profound and enduring. In health policy, proposed reforms in 71, private employer mandate for health insurance, federalized Medicaid for poor families, robust support for HMOs. A limited HMO bill ultimately passed in 73. In 74, proposed even more comprehensive reforms. Concerned about rising drug use domestically and among soldiers in Vietnam, he launched a war on drugs. Pledged to cut off foreign supply, significantly increased funds for education rehabilitation, passed the Controlled Substances Act.
The start of the modern war on drugs.
He also called for more funding for sickle cell research, treatment, education in 71, signed the National Sickle Cell Anemia Control Act in 72, earmarking significant federal funds even while reducing overall NIH spending.
And crucially, his presidency saw the first large-scale integration of public schools in the South. This was a challenging balancing act. Nixon pursued his Southern strategy, aiming for middle ground between segregationists like George Wallace and liberal Democrats.
Playing both sides.
Explicitly hoped to win Southern white votes by appealing to racial conservatism while still moving forward with integration. Appointed VP Agnew to lead a task force, though much actual work done by Labor Secretary George Shultz, to integrate schools. Offered federal aid, presidential meetings as incentives. By September 70, less than 10% of black children attended segregated schools in the South. Dramatic shift. However, by 71, tensions flared over busing to achieve racial balance. Angry protests in northern cities, a new front in the civil rights struggle. Nixon personally opposed busing, but enforced court orders requiring it.
A difficult position.
Some scholars argue Nixon actually slowed desegregation to boost his 72 election chances, playing a nuanced political game. But on other fronts, implemented the Philadelphia Plan in 70, the first significant federal affirmative action program. Endorsed the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, after it passed Congress in 72, though feminists criticized him for not doing more for ratification. He also appointed more women to administration positions than LBJ and advanced black capitalism for African-American civil rights and economic equity.
This really prompts us to consider how his administration navigated such a complex set of priorities, often driven by a mix of political calculation and genuine reform. The space race, for example, another significant area. Nixon presided over the Apollo 11 moon landing, July 69. Momentous achievement, famously speaking with Armstrong and Aldrin, calling it the most historic phone call ever made from the White House.
Iconic moment.
This monumental achievement, however, occurred as budgetary realities were rapidly shifting. Nixon was unwilling to maintain NASA's high 60s funding levels, politically unsustainable post-Apollo. Rejected ambitious plans for a permanent moon base, crewed Mars expedition due to immense costs.
Budget cuts hit space hard.
His administration also canceled the Air Force Manned Orbital Laboratory, opting for more cost-effective, uncrewed spy satellites. NASA canceled the last 3 Apollo lunar missions to free up funds for Skylab and the Space Shuttle program. What's truly insightful here is despite these significant cuts, he also approved a 5-year cooperative program between NASA and the Soviet space program in May 72, culminating in the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz joint mission.
Cooperation instead of competition.
Reflects a shift from a competitive space race to one of international cooperation, again demonstrating his pragmatic, strategic approach to global relations, even in space.
And it all seemed to be coming together for him politically in 1972. Nixon believed his Southern strategy was causing a fundamental political realignment, turning the Democratic solid South Republican. He even nominated 2 Southern conservatives to the Supreme Court, Haynsworth and Carswell, although neither was confirmed, signaling his intent.
Testing the waters.
Announced his candidacy for re-election January 72, virtually assured the Republican nomination. His Democratic opponent, George McGovern, was unfortunately damaged by his policies. Reduced defense spending, draft amnesty, abortion rights. Famously perceived as advocating amnesty, abortion, and acid, hurt him with many voters. Tough label to shake. McGovern was also severely hurt by his vacillating support for DP running mate Thomas Eagleton after revelations about Eagleton's past electroshock therapy treatments.
Yeah, the Eagleton affair was disastrous for McGovern.
As a result, Nixon won in a landslide. took over 60% of the popular vote, losing only Massachusetts and D.C., one of the largest landslide victories in American history.
It truly seemed like the culmination of a remarkable comeback story, cementing his place as a dominant political figure. However, what's profoundly ironic here is that this electoral triumph was quickly overshadowed by a scandal already brewing, one that would irrevocably alter his presidency in American political history in ways he could never have imagined.
And that brewing scandal, of course, was Watergate. The term Watergate came to encompass a wide range of illegal activities by the Nixon administration, from dirty tricks like bugging political opponents to harassing activist groups through government agencies.
It was more than just a burglary.
The scandal truly began with the June 17, 1972 break-in at the Democratic National Committee office located in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C.
What's genuinely fascinating is how the pieces slowly began to connect, largely due to tenacious journalism. Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, relying on their confidential informant Deep Throat,
Mark Felt,
later revealed as FBI Associate Director Mark Felt, linked the burglars directly to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CRP, and ultimately to the Nixon administration. Nixon initially downplayed it as mere politics, calling news articles biased, misleading. However, revelations soon made it clear the CRP and later the White House itself were deeply involved in sabotage and cover-up efforts. Ultimately, 48 officials, including senior aides like White House counsel John Dean, were convicted of wrongdoing.
Then, July 1973, White House aide Alexander Butterfield dropped that bombshell during Senate testimony. Nixon had a secret taping system in the Oval Office.
The tapes, that changed everything.
Critical turning point. Watergate special counsel Archibald Cox immediately subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon offered only heavily edited transcripts, citing executive privilege. This standoff led to the infamous Saturday Night Massacre in October '73, when Nixon fired Cox, sparked a national outcry. Leon Jaworski replaced Cox, but public trust was severely eroded. And here's where the narrative gets truly dramatic. November 1973, an 18.5-minute gap was mysteriously discovered on a crucial June 20, 1972, tape recorded just after the Watergate break-in.
The gap. What really happened there?
Rosemary Woods, Nixon's personal secretary, claimed she accidentally wiped it while transcribing. A story widely mocked, contributed to public cynicism. This gap, while not conclusive proof, deeply eroded what little trust remained. Despite eroding support, even within his own party, Nixon rejected accusations, vowed to stay, admitted mistakes, but claimed no prior knowledge of the burglary or cover-up until early '73.
Looking at the broader implications, the scandal was escalating dramatically even as other events unfolded. October 10, '73, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned.
Right, but for unrelated charges.
Unrelated charges of bribery, tax evasion, money laundering during his Maryland governorship meant Nixon had to appoint a new VP. Chose Gerald Ford, the highly respected House Minority Leader. This, however, did little to stem the tide of Watergate. November 17, '73, during that televised press conference, Nixon famously declared, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got."
Such a defiant statement.
The legal battle over the tapes continued relentlessly. April '74, Nixon released 1,200 pages of transcripts, hoping to satisfy public demand. However, the House Judiciary Committee then opened televised impeachment hearings May 9, '74, raised the stakes dramatically. July 24, the Supreme Court unanimously ordered the release of the full, unedited tapes, a decisive legal blow. The most damning revelation came August 5, '74, with the release of the smoking gun tape.
The smoking gun.
This tape, recorded just 6 days after the break-in, revealed Nixon had been told of the White House connection to the burglaries and had explicitly approved cover-up plans. Nixon, facing undeniable evidence, accepted blame for misleading the country. Crucially, key Republican leaders, Hugh Scott, Barry Goldwater, informed him he faced certain impeachment by the House and removal by the Senate. The political will had evaporated.
This was the point of no return. August 8, 1974, facing undeniable loss of political support, certain impeachment, Nixon addressed the nation on television from the Oval Office, announced his resignation, effective the following day, August 9.
Unprecedented.
In that televised speech, he stated he was resigning for the good of the country, asked for support for Gerald Ford. Notably reviewed his accomplishments, particularly foreign policy, clearly wanting to define his legacy on his own terms. In defense of his presidency, his character, he quoted Theodore Roosevelt's Man in the Arena speech, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at the best knows in the end the triumphs of high achievements, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly.
Trying to frame it.
Initial responses from commentators were generally favorable. though Roger Mudd at CBS criticized it for lacking an admission of wrongdoing. Biographer Conrad Black, however, called it a masterpiece for converting humiliation into a virtual parliamentary acknowledgement of almost blameless insufficiency of legislative support. Historically, Nixon became the only U.S. president to resign.
This leads us to a crucial question. How does one recover from such a profound public fall? After resigning, Nixon flew to his home in San Clemente, California. Biographer Jonathan Aitken described him as a soul in torment. Less than a month later, Gerald Ford granted him that full, free, and absolute pardon, September 8, 1974, ended any possibility of indictment for Watergate crimes. Nixon issued a statement acknowledging he was wrong in not acting more decisively, dealing with Watergate.
A limited mea culpa.
Soon after, he suffered phlebitis, underwent surgery, was excused from testifying at his former AIDS trial. This period of illness, legal battles underscored the immense personal and political cost. But Nixon was, at his core, a fighter, driven by almost defiant resilience. By early '75, began planning a comeback. Focused on writing his memoirs, R.N., the memoirs of Richard Nixon, published '78, the first of 9 books he'd authored.
Always planning the next move.
The significant turning point in his public rehabilitation came with the 1977 David Frost interviews. Frost famously paid him $600,000 for a series of sit-downs, most notably delving into Watergate. Nixon admitted, "I had let down the country and I brought myself down."
Those interviews were huge.
Massive television event, 45-50 million viewers, significantly improved his public image and financial situation, a calculated risk that paid off.
He wasn't just writing and reflecting. He was actively re-engaging with the world as a kind of elder statesman, visiting China again in '76 at Mao's personal invitation, testament to his diplomatic achievements. 1980 defied the State Department to attend the funeral of the Shah of Iran, widely seen as America's unofficial presence. Actively supported Ronald Reagan in '80, positioning himself as a seasoned, respected figure in foreign policy.
Rebuilding his influence.
Throughout the 1980s, traveled extensively, met foreign leaders, influenced policy. His '86 visit to the Soviet Union led him to send Reagan a lengthy memo with foreign policy suggestions, personal impressions of Gorbachev. Remarkably, a Gallup poll even ranked him among the 10 most admired men.
Incredible turnaround.
His public rehabilitation culminated in '86 when he impressed a convention of newspaper publishers with his insightful tour d'horizon of world affairs. Newsweek proclaimed Nixon's comeback. 1990, the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace opened in Yorba Linda, with Ford, Reagan, Bush Sr. in attendance. Symbolic restoration. Founded the Nixon Center in D.C. in '94, continues to influence foreign policy discussions. Tragically, his wife Pat died in June '93, which deeply affected him. Demonstrated his profound personal side despite public stoicism.
What's truly remarkable here is the sheer force of will that allowed him to rebuild his public life after such a devastating fall. Speaks to a unique, almost defiant resilience and a determination to shape his own legacy.
And then, the final chapter. Richard Nixon suffered a severe stroke April 18, 1994. Died 4 days later, April 22, age 81. His funeral, April 27, 1994, in Yorba Linda, truly historic event, attended by 5 sitting and former U.S. presidents, Clinton, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, buried next to his wife. Mourners waited in lines up to 3 miles long, estimated 42,000 people to pay final respect.
Huge turnout.
The media reaction to his death, while certainly mentioning Watergate, was largely favorable. Some argued he was one of our most far-sighted chief executives. However, not everyone agreed. Columnists like Russell Baker criticized a group conspiracy to grant him absolution. Hunter S. Thompson famously called him a political monster, a very dangerous enemy.
Strong words.
Cartoonist Jeff Koterba captured the complexity perfectly, depicted history before a blank canvas, Nixon as the subject, urging viewers to be patient as the portrait would take time to complete, being a little more complicated than most.
This really prompts us to ask, how do we ultimately evaluate such an idiosyncratic president so brilliant and so morally lacking? Historian James McGregor Burns' question perfectly encapsulates the challenge of Nixon's legacy. Evaluations remain incredibly complex, constantly contrasting the successes with the acrimonious departure. Nixon himself clearly viewed his policies on Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union as central to his place in history, his peacemaker role. Even his one-time opponent, George McGovern, acknowledged in '83 that Nixon probably had a more practical approach to the two superpowers. Nixon really will get high marks in history for foreign policy, except Vietnam. Christopher Andrew called him a great statesman on the world stage, despite being a shabby practitioner of electoral politics. Unquote. Domestically, credited with significant environmental regulatory legislation EPA Endangered Species Act, though some argue these were driven more by political expediency than strong environmentalism, that characteristic mix of pragmatism and ambition.
His Southern strategy is often credited with fundamentally realigning the South Republican, though some attribute this more to underlying economic and social factors already at play. What's often overlooked is throughout his career, Nixon consistently moved his party away from isolationists. As a congressman, a persuasive advocate of containing Soviet communism, setting a long-term foreign policy direction for the GOP.
However, historian Keith W. Olson notes Nixon also left a legacy of fundamental mistrust of government deeply rooted in Vietnam and Watergate, led to a temporary decrease in presidential power, lasting public cynicism. Herbert Parmet described Nixon's role as steering the Republican Party along a middle course, a path he himself embodied. Nixon, often seen as a progressive conservative, famously stating his heart was on the right and his head was, with FDR, slightly left of center. This approach sought a middle ground between growth liberals and minimalist government, defied easy categorization.
So complex.
His career was always dogged by his complex personality, secretive, awkward in personal interactions, but strikingly reflective in writing, strategic thinking. Often portrayed with exaggerated features by cartoonists, blurring the line between man and caricature, confessed to being inclined to distance himself, even from close friends, believed one should keep your troubles to yourself. When told most Americans didn't truly know him, he replied, "Yeah, it's true, and it's not necessary for them to know."
Wow. Guarded to the end.
Richard Reeves argues his presidency was ultimately doomed by his personality, stating, "He assumed the worst in people, and he brought out the worst in them. He could not open himself to other men, and he could not open himself to greatness." The later release of 1999 tapes revealing derogatory statements about Jews further complicates his image, adding another layer.
So given all this, what are the ultimate takeaways from the life of Richard Nixon? Today we've taken a deep dive into the paradoxical life of Richard Nixon, the brilliant strategist who achieved monumental foreign policy breakthroughs, enacted progressive domestic legislation, yet whose presidency was ultimately defined by a scandal born of paranoia and, well, profound deception. We encourage you to reflect. What aspects of Nixon's story, his incredible resilience, his undeniable ambition, his strategic vision, or his profound human failings most resonate with you? And why? What does his enduring story teach us about the nature of leadership, the complex interplay of power and personality, and the lasting impact of personal character on public office?
Looking back, and given his eventual rehabilitation and the ongoing reevaluation of his policies, how do we finally weigh this incredible figure? Was Richard Nixon ultimately a victim of his own insecurities, a product of his tumultuous times, or simply a man whose extraordinary abilities were inextricably linked to his profound human failings? How do we, as a society, balance the triumphs and transgressions of our leaders, especially when those individuals so fundamentally shaped our world?
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of America's most complex and enduring figures. We hope you'll continue to reflect on the nuances of his legacy long after this deep dive ends.